So many Canadian foods are actually desserts. Are you ready to see my top 5? Let's dig in. Welcome to Canadian Culture Club. On this channel, we talk about all things Canadian culture, life, work, education, travel, etc. to prepare you for your move or your trip to Canada. Today we have a really fun video all about Canadian desserts. This is just part 1 of 2 though, so make sure that you've hit the subscribe button and the notification below so that you do not miss our part 2 on Canadian desserts. 1 or 2 of these desserts you can get internationally, or you could make them internationally, but others you're only going to find here in Canada. So let's take a look. Dessert number 1, butter tarts. Butter tarts are my personal favorite Canadian desserts, and they're especially common in the province I'm from, Ontario. But there's a little bit of debate about whether they came from here originally or maybe they came from Quebec. First of all, what are butter tarts? Well, they are tarts. So they have a pastry shell that is filled with a buttery, gooey center. So it's usually made of brown sugar, butter, and egg. There are some really common add-ins too, like pecans or raisins. You can find almost anything today, but the pecans and raisins are my preferred add-ins, and if I really had to choose, it would be pecans. You might also hear people say pecans. I would say most Canadians say pecans. So what about that debate between Ontario and Quebec? Well, the first actual recorded recipe of a butter tart appeared in a 1900 cookbook from Ontario. More specifically, Barrie, Ontario, because it appeared in the book, The Women's Auxiliary of the Royal Victoria Hospital Cookbook. The Royal Victoria Hospital was a hospital in Barrie. However, this is the first time the recipe appeared in writing, but there are theories about the actual recipe and people making versions of it going back quite a lot longer, even to, and I need to check the name, and please pardon my French, Filles Amériques, which is probably terribly pronounced. As you can see, not all Canadians are good at speaking French. Not all French-speaking Canadians are good at speaking English, but basically it translates to marriageable girls. So these were girls or young women who arrived in the French colony that would become Quebec back in the 1600s. So there's some evidence that they were making a recipe that may have been butter tarts, or at least were very similar to butter tarts. So there's some debate about, did it really come from Quebec from 1600s, or did it show up in Ontario maybe not long before 1900, the first time that it appeared in writing? I love butter tarts. I think they're very hard to find outside of Canada, but you can probably try making them at home because all of the ingredients should be available to you. So I will leave some really great recipes in the description box on YouTube or the show notes on the podcast for all of these desserts and the recipes and really cool history behind them. Check out the full blog post in the YouTube description or the podcast show notes below. Dessert number 2, the Nanaimo Bar. This one has way less debate behind it because Nanaimo is actually a city in British Columbia. So it's a very specific location that they come from. However, we actually don't know anything else about their mysterious origins. We just know that they're from Nanaimo, which is a city on Vancouver Island in BC, British Columbia, but we don't know when or how they were invented. The first recipe that was a formal recipe for it appeared in 1950, but it probably existed a while before that. So what is a Nanaimo bar? Well, it starts with a graham cracker crumb and mix-ins foundation. So essentially graham crackers, but you'll see some other stuff in there usually. It has a custard middle, and then the top layer is a mix of semi-sweet chocolate and butter. Delicious. Something really cool is that Nanaimo has embraced their Nanaimo Bar claim to fame. So they've actually made a map. The city has made a map that connects all of the places where you can get Nanaimo bars. So it's essentially a self-guided trail around the city to try as many Nanaimo bars as possible. But there's no way, I promise you, you can look at the map because it's linked in today's description and show notes. There's no way you could eat all of them in one day. You would die. There's no way. But you could spend a couple of days in Nanaimo and actually try a gazillion different Nanaimo bars. It's also a dessert you'll see at school bake fairs a lot of the time, where parents will bring Nanaimo bars that they've made themselves. It's a really classic example that you'll see in schools. Dessert number 3. Compared to Nanaimo bars and definitely butter tarts, the origins of dessert 3, Beaver Tails, are much more straightforward. Beaver Tails come from one specific chain called Beaver Tails, or I'm going to say it terribly again, Cuisine de Castor in French. Please forgive me. Beaver Tails are from a really specific town from Ontario called Killaloe. It's a really strange spelling, so if you're on the YouTube version, you'll be able to see it on the screen in front of you now. But that's basically where the first chain was from, where the family was from that created it. So we know that the founder's grandma, their grandma was the person who actually started this recipe. So before you freak out, beaver tails are not actually made from the tails of the animal, the beaver. They are just the shape of a beaver's tail. So they're actually fried dough. It's just pastry, and then it has different toppings on it. My favorite is, the original is covered in brown sugar. Super straightforward. My favorite is, I believe it's called the Killaloe Sunrise, which is the same thing, brown sugar, but then you can squeeze lemon on top of it. And it's incredibly delicious. So deep fried dough essentially, but it's very special and very Canadian. There are also a lot of modern flavors, of course, that are even collaborations with things like Oreo, Reese's Pieces. I think, what was the other one? Score bars, if you know those chocolate bars. So there's tons of modern variations. I think there's one that has like a Nutella or maybe just chocolate and banana on top of it. You'll find one version of a beaver tail that you absolutely love, because who doesn't like fried dough? So you'll usually find beaver tails near Canadian tourist sites. I remember seeing one kind of randomly in Ottawa, but in Toronto, the only ones I can think of are down by Harbourfront, so like right along Lake Ontario, or at the Toronto Zoo. They're not like around you as you live here. So they're even kind of a special thing for most Canadians, because we tend to see them only when we go to special activities or festivals in the summer. There usually is a beaver tail like truck that'll come to a festival in your neighborhood in the summer. So it's still a pretty special event. But what's interesting is that you can find beaver tails outside of Canada, even though it's a chain restaurant. So I have the list of countries here. You will find some beaver tails in Mexico, France, the United Arab Emirates, and Japan. I don't fully know why, and I don't know why they picked those countries, but if you live in one of them, cool, try and find them. Let me know if you find it and take a picture. Dessert number 4, Saskatoon Berry pies. Saskatoon Berry pies come from Canada's prairies, so kind of the middle of Canada, where the land is flat for the most part. It does range from the west all the way even into kind of the northeastern United States. So there's a big, almost diagonal kind of range of Saskatoon berries. Sometimes they're called service berries or June berries, but they really do come from the prairies. These, at least Saskatoon berry pies, come from the prairies in Canada, and that's where these berries grow in absolute abundance. They're used in things like jam too. Saskatoon berries are sweet and nutty. They really handle the cold well. They can weather the cold, we would say. And they actually have some more health benefits than blueberries. Saskatoon berries have been used for a really, really long time by the indigenous people of their growth range in dyes and foods. And also it was used by early European settlers who were very attracted to them because they weather the cold so incredibly well. So you can have berries even in super cold seasons. So it's a lot of nutritional value there. Plus they're super tasty. And that's really important too, because you might not get a lot of tasty fresh food in the wintertime in the origin days of European settlers in Canada. A lot of it was not super tasty because it was focused on preservation basically. So there would be something to eat in the winter. Saskatoon berries were probably a little juicy delight to have in the middle of all of that. So Saskatoon berry pies, to get back to the official dessert we're talking about, are pies. So they're made using a traditional pie crust, ideally homemade if you can. And basically the berries are tossed together with, let me double check, sugar and either cornstarch or tapioca. So in many ways, it is kind of a simple pie, but with a really special ingredient that might be hard to get your hands on outside of Canada and some parts of the United States today. From one berry to another, we have our 5th dessert, which is a blueberry grunt. The wonderfully named blueberry grunt comes from Nova Scotia in Canada. It's a yummy blueberry mixture that's then topped with biscuit dough. In a lot of ways, it's similar to a blueberry crumble, if you've ever heard of crumbles, but the biggest difference is how it's cooked. So crumbles are usually baked in an oven, whereas a blueberry grunt, in many ways it's the same ingredients, but they are cooked on the stovetop. So that might be in like a Dutch oven or even a pan. So it's just kind of a different way of cooking them with somewhat different results, especially around texture. Like I mentioned, I've done a lot of recipe research for this video, and I learned from Kelly Neal, whose recipe is going to be linked in the description box on YouTube and in the show notes on the podcast, the origins of the name grunt. So grunt in English is usually a sound, right? It's like a sound you make with a closed mouth. And you might say that someone grunts instead of speaking. They just kind of make little sounds, especially teenage boys. But the idea is that a blueberry grunt makes grunting sounds while it's cooking, usually in the Dutch oven. So it'll kind of make those sounds, I guess. I've never tried making it, but according to Kelly, that's why it has its name. Now, Kelly also suggests serving the blueberry grunt with lemon curd or whipped, heavy, or clotted cream and a hot cup of tea per tradition. So this is a really interesting Nova Scotia recipe that I myself would like to try cooking at some point. All right, I'll have 4 more desserts for you in part 2 of our Canadian desserts series. If you liked today's episode, let me know by hitting the like button and also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss part 2. Remember, for recipes and the blog post version of this episode, be sure to check out the YouTube description or the podcast show notes. What else do you want to hear about Canada? Let me know in the comments on YouTube. I would love to hear your requests so we can create videos that are going to be especially useful and interesting for you. All right, thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time, eh?